My name is Michael Cabbage, and at the time of the Columbia accident on February 1st, 2003, I was the Kennedy Space Center Bureau Chief for the Orlando Sentinel and Tribune newspapers. Today, I am the Director of News and Multimedia for NASA headquarters at Washington. February 1st, 2003 was a memorable day for everyone who covered space, obviously, at the Kennedy Space Center. Like most of my colleagues, I was out at the shuttle landing facility and arrived there an hour before the scheduled touchdown, which I believe was around 9:15 Eastern Time on that morning. And my recollections of that day are that there were far fewer reporters than typically come to the shuttle landings. In fact, they had sort of diminished over time as people had grown less and less interested. But the crowd was decent sized that day because of the fact that Elon Ramon, the first Israeli astronaut, was coming back, and that was sort of the news hook for everybody who had come. Also, the budget rollout was scheduled to happen the following Monday, which was Monday, February the 3rd. And there were a lot of reporters who had come to hopefully get some sort of quote or to talk about the budget rollout with then NASA Administrator Sean O'Keefe, who was there at the shuttle landing facility that day also. And there was always sort of an informal kind of press conference, if you will, after the shuttle landed, where across the fence that separated the NASA VIP site of the shuttle landing facility from the journalist side, people would go to the fence, they'd talk, and a lot of people were planning to ask Mr. O'Keefe some budget questions, obviously not having any idea that what was going to happen happened. So I was there that morning waiting for the shuttle to land like everyone else, and suddenly the communications started getting a lot more sporadic than I had ever remembered that happening in the past. In fact, the comm dropouts were much lengthier than the typical dropouts that you would hear during a shuttle landing. So there was this almost sort of a blockhouse office that was at the old shuttle landing facility before they remodeled it following the accident. And it was where the public affairs officers usually worked out of. There was a counter with some desks behind it. And I walked into that facility, and I'll never forget looking at NASA television, which of course would show a graphic of the United States where the shuttle would travel across the United States, and it would have its landing path down to the Kennedy Space Center. And there was a diamond, a red diamond that was in the middle of that that would sort of trace the progress of the shuttle across the U.S. that was based on telemetry. And that diamond was frozen over Texas, over central Texas. And I remember thinking, wow, that's really strange. And about that time, there's a teleconference that usually is live during shuttle landings called PAO Chord, where I heard one of the public affairs officers at the Johnson Space Center say all the sensor dropouts we're seeing are associated with the left wing. I remembered that there was a debris hit that had happened during the liftoff on the left wing, and there had been some discussion during the mission itself about analyses going on behind the scenes, engineering analyses to determine whether, could have caused any significant damage to the left wing, or whether it would be a problem for reentry. And having, like many people, sources in the program, they had all told me it would not be an issue, and that, of course, was the ultimate conclusion that the team had come to. But when I heard that, like other reporters, I'm sure, it became clear that, well, maybe there was an issue there. So a few minutes later, there was no signal from Mila that the shuttle, the long-range radar that sees the shuttle on approach to the Kennedy Space Center, that the shuttle wasn't on the horizon. It couldn't find it. And for me, that was like a dead giveaway. Okay, something really bad wrong has happened here. So I arrived back at the Kennedy Space Center press site, Launch Complex 39 press site, maybe an hour and 15 minutes after Columbia's scheduled arrival time. Went back to the double-wide trailer, which was sort of the Orlando Sentinel bureau at the Space Center at the time, and wrote immediately an extra edition, the copy for that, which was on the street in the city of Orlando about 2 hours later, and then sat down and wrote stories both for the Orlando Sentinel and for the larger Tribune newspaper group that were distributed to all the everyone who had the Tribune Knight Ridder Newswire at the time. and all the Tribune newspapers. And after finishing up on all of that, which was about 6 or 7 p.m., drove by my house long enough for my wife to hand me a suitcase in the driveway, and then headed to the Orlando airport and got on an airplane for Houston. One of the things that I had done in my past as a reporter when I worked in South Florida for Tribune newspapers and the South Florida Sun Sentinel was covered the crash of ValueJet in the Everglades. And having done that, I understood a little about FAA investigations and how they worked. The sort of process that FAA investigators go through, when facts become available to the public, when they're released to the news media, sort of the expectations that I had as a reporter in terms of getting information were kind of guided by that. And so when I found out that a lot of FAA people were involved ultimately with the Columbia accident investigation, I think that was a real help to me in sort of knowing what to expect. A difference, I guess, in the Columbia accident and the Challenger accident that a lot of people I've worked with, journalists who covered both, and of course I would remember the Challenger accident well myself, is that the Challenger accident seemed different in that it was, and I don't want to in any way minimize the Columbia accident, but the Challenger accident was almost sort of a national tragedy in a way that, again, one of the only things I can equate it to from when I was very young was, President Kennedy's assassination or something of that magnitude. It really was a national tragedy, and it was something that, given NASA's reputation and coming, on the heels of the moon landings and things like that, but people were in absolute disbelief. And again, I don't want to in any way minimize the sort of anguish and sorrow and the trauma that the Columbia accident caused, but in many ways the Columbia accident seemed much more to me like a major airline accident than it did the sort of accident that we had with Challenger. And another reason that might contribute to that is, again, you didn't have the visuals of the shuttle exploding during launch, in front of television cameras and, and millions of people. What happened with Columbia, I mean, there was some imagery of the shuttle's breakup over Texas, but it was nowhere near as dramatic as what we saw with 51L. At the time I began reporting on the Columbia accident, the Challenger accident really it wasn't something I thought about much, only that there was this sort of concern, I guess is the best way to put it, that a lot of reporters had, having known about the way the Challenger accident was handled by NASA Public Affairs and the difficulty in getting information out, that people were sort of concerned that the NASA's posture might be similar in terms of how forthcoming they were, how quickly information was made available, that sort of thing. And I think everyone who had concerns were quickly sort of allayed by the way that NASA Public Affairs and senior leadership at NASA and ultimately the administrator, Sean O'Keefe, handled the Columbia accident. If anything, it was night and day different. The Columbia accident, information was put out incredibly quickly. There were constant news conferences. I know from knowing a little about what was going on in the background at the time, that a lot of the really key information was made available to the public almost as quickly as some of the investigators got it. I know that a lot of the documents and the information that reporters were looking at, everything from emails to analyses and that sort of thing that were subject to the Freedom of Information Act, many of those documents were posted online by NASA, whereas during the the Challenger accident, I don't think there was any thought given to making some of the similar documents available in a timely fashion to the news media. So I think everyone who was familiar with both Challenger and Columbia was really, really happy, elated with the way that NASA decided to approach it during the Columbia accident, because there really was a culture change, a sort of sea change in the way that NASA came out with information. I think the way that the CAIB started up in terms of the public affairs representation, overall I thought it worked relatively smoothly. There was a NASA person who was initially put in charge, I guess, briefly to take phone calls and to field the media queries, but it seemed like almost overnight from a press perspective that Laura Brown of the FAA was there and took charge. And Laura, again, from my perspective at the time as a reporter, and I can appreciate this even now, even more now working in a similar job to the one she holds at FAA, is she did an absolutely terrific job of pulling everything together, making information available, setting expectations by reporters in terms of what they were going to get and getting it in a timely fashion. If you're a journalist, one of the most important things is that if somebody says they're going to give you information by a certain deadline, that they follow through on that. And Laura was tremendous at that. She also cultivated relationships with reporters beyond working hours in terms of going to dinner, having a drink, things like of that sort, which are incredibly valuable to reporters when you're trying to get insight into the things that you're writing about, and you're not necessarily looking to write a story based on what you're being told, but you're getting guidance that's off the record that helps inform your reporting in a larger way in terms of the things that are really going on behind the scenes and what people are looking at. And Laura was really, really good at keeping a lot of reporters in the loop and sort of helping to guide their overall reporting in a way that benefited both news media and the Accident Investigation Board, because it doesn't serve anybody's purposes if you're a reporter and you're writing stuff that's bad wrong. That's not good, because it makes you look bad as a journalist, and it doesn't help the CAIB either, because there's these newspaper reports that are out there that have wildly inaccurate information. And I thought Laura did a really nice job of helping keep people on the right path and marshaling all the CAIB sort of resources in terms of the people who are on the board and the people who are the staff members in hooking them up with news media in a way that kept everybody on the same page. One of the things that invariably happens whenever you have an accident of this sort is lots of reporters from lots of news organizations sort of descend on the story. Some of them are familiar, some of them are beat reporters who know their stuff, are familiar with the subject matter, and others aren't. They're people who sort of parachute in, general assignment reporters who may have some general knowledge of what's going on, but they're there because they work for a large news organization to, frankly, compete for honors and awards and things of that sort in some cases. In fact, the term we had for it at the time when I was a journalist with Tribune Company was contest entry journalism. And whether you're looking for Emmys or whether you're looking for Pulitzers or whatever, that's one reason that news organizations marshal the sort of resources they do to cover these things. One of the things that kind of caused a feeding frenzy surrounding the Columbia accident was the fact that some of the key players who were involved as information started to come out, Linda Ham, who was the head of the mission management team at the time, Rodney Rocha, who was an engineer at Johnson Space Center, who had expressed some sort of concerns about the debris analysis and the impact analysis. They weren't accessible by the news media. And whenever people aren't available and newspaper reporters or print or broadcast reporters aren't able to ask them questions, then it just sort of fuels this frenzy even more. There's a lot of speculation about what had gone on, what their roles were, what was happening behind the scenes. And ultimately, NASA made both of those people available. Linda Ham, in fact, I remember they had a news conference at the Johnson Space Center. I don't remember the exact time frame, but it wasn't terribly long after the accident happened. And whereas Rodney, to my knowledge, was never part of a news conference, he did grant interview requests later on to specific reporters. And I think the lesson here is that whenever you can be forthcoming without violating some sort of confidentiality concerns or other concerns that you have about not releasing information right away, it's always wise to put people up to talk to the news media themselves if they're able to communicate well at all. Simply because the speculation and the sort of dire worst case scenarios that people can draw up are almost always worse than what happened in real life. You're generally almost always better off talking to news organizations and reporters than you are in not talking to them. There's one of the sort of old adages of public affairs too is it's always best to tell your own bad news. And in this case, I think NASA showed that repeatedly throughout the way they handled the Columbia accident. One of the early issues that I think a lot of reporters talked about a lot, although for me it was sort of less of an issue for reasons I'll explain, is the whole question of the independence of the Columbia Accident Investigation Board. Unlike the Rogers Commission, which was a presidential commission, NASA sort of stood up the CAIB by itself. And I know there were a lot of reporters who kind of wondered aloud if the board had the independence that was required to do the job. The reason that really never bothered me, and I never really got into a lot of the issues in my reporting on who was being compensated by what entity and that sort of thing, is it was pretty clear in talking to the members of the board, and in particular Admiral Gaiman, who was part of the Cole investigation before he did the Columbia investigation, that this was a person who was not going to be sort of guided by anyone. He had a knowledge of investigative procedure, and he had sort of a big picture viewpoint and just a general temperament, at least from my observation, that again, anyone who worked around Admiral Gaiman very long or knew him very long, I think it was clear to them that he was not going to be sort of in anybody's pocket, that he was going to tell the facts as he saw it. And in fact, that was exactly his reputation, and if you look at the Cole investigation, precisely what he did, in a way that frankly a lot of people I would imagine in the Pentagon thought might have been embarrassing. So that was never anything I really worried about, especially when you look at some of the issues they dealt with and how they dealt with them. There was no attempt to sort of gloss things over. The only thing that I wish the CAIB had done a little differently that the Rogers Commission did, that I think was valuable, especially for the public, although Gaiman had a compelling counter-argument to this too, was I wish some of the interviews they had done with key people that they were talking to had been done publicly the way they were done with the Rogers Commission. Most of the interviews that the CAIB had publicly were with academics or scientists on much more broad, general topics. They weren't sort of fact-finding discussions with people like the members of the mission management team or the shuttle program managers or things of that sort. Now, Admiral Gaiman, when I interviewed him later on for a book that I wrote, his response was, well, we thought that if we put these people before, television cameras and bright lights and a giant public audience, that we wouldn't get the same candor in their responses that we would if we interviewed them privately. And there, of course, can be an argument made for that. But that would have been my only, and criticism isn't the right word, that would be my only observation, that I think the public hearings might have been a little more useful, at least to the public, if they had directly explored some of these fact-finding questions instead of these much broader general issues. One of the things I'd like to talk about is the changes in the press that have really intensified since the Columbia accident. And if NASA was ever in a similar position to this one in the future, it probably would be a very different sort of environment in terms of the reporting environment that this would all unfold in. There are far fewer beat reporters today than there were even 9 years ago at the time of the Columbia accident, and certainly far, far fewer than there were 15, 20 years ago. And what that means in terms of the everyday way that public affairs officers operate and NASA senior management operates is the skill set and the level of knowledge and the expertise on the subject matter, on NASA, on the shuttle when it was around, on ISS, on any sort of NASA system you want to talk about, is going to be vastly different than it was before, when beat reporters who covered the space agency day in and day out had a sort of expertise themselves on this. Today, because of vast changes in the world of print and broadcast journalism, there are very few news organizations that still have the luxury of dedicated space reporters. Far more often they have more general assignment reporters who will be tasked to sort of parachute into a subject like this and get up to speed in a hurry and try to do the best that they can. This also typically means that they don't have sources, people they've cultivated over the years who can explain things to them off the record or on background and give them a reality check and say, yeah, that's exactly right, that makes a lot of sense, I think you're heading down the right path here, or no, that's not right, that's way off, sort of thing. So one of the things that I think we need to be mindful of, if God forbid we ever wind up in a situation like this again, is that we're going to be the reporters and the journalism core that we sort of communicate through is going to be very different than it was in the past. One of the ways that we can sort of get around that, and we increasingly do this on a daily basis anyway, is by communicating directly to the public. With the sort of advent of the social media and the web presence that NASA has and NASA television, we have the ability to tell our story and to communicate directly with the public in the way that we've never had in the past before, at least not to the extent that we have in the past. And one of the things that I'm sure we'll do in the future is we will utilize all those resources to talk directly to our stakeholders, the public at large, and to the news media in a way that we haven't before, instead of relying on the journalists to sort of tell our story for us. Once upon a time, 20 or 30 years ago, that was really the only way to do it before there was a really developed NASA television, before there was any sort of internet presence at all. The only way to communicate to a mass audience is you had to deal with someone who had access to a mass audience, and that was either the owner of a mass medium or someone who worked for the owner of a mass medium. Today, with the web, with NASA's television reach being the way that it is, we have the ability to talk to millions of people on our own. And that's certainly something that, whether you're talking about an accident or some sort of contingency or not, is something we're going to want to continue to utilize and take better advantage of as we move forward. One of the things that surprised me the most as a reporter covering this accident was that a system as fundamental to the shuttle as the thermal protection system, and one that had operated on the shuttle for so long, that it would be so fundamentally misunderstood in some respects by some of the agency's top engineers. There seemed to be sort of an acceptance as time went on from the beginning of the program of increasing strikes on the thermal protection system by foam from the external tank, that while people, I guess, intellectually knew that it could, in theory, cause a catastrophic failure, they started tolerating more and bigger hits in a way that you could argue led to what happened with STS-107. Diane Vaughan, who wrote a book called The Challenger Launch Decision, actually talked about this when she talked about the normalization of deviance. And it was, NASA had an expression they used, and probably still do, called whether something was in family or whether it's out of family. And as long as the foam strikes on the orbiter during launch were in family, as long as they had been seen before and hadn't caused a catastrophic failure, I think the sort of inclination was that we can live with these until we figure out a longer-term solution. That yes, these are bad, yes, we don't want these, but they're primarily a turnaround issue. And we do need to figure out a way to mitigate these, but we have some time to do this and we'll implement it over time. I don't think, with maybe the exception of a very few people, that there was a lot of sentiment out there at the time of the 107 accident to ground the shuttle until there was a solution found for debris shedding from the bipod area on the external tank. I think that informed my writing in a way. Frankly, it made me sort of much more skeptical of the most fundamental assumptions that had been made about not only the thermal protection system on the shuttle, but the operation of the shuttle and the sort of what was being planned for return to flight. It sort of drove home, I guess, the point that, you know, we hadn't learned from 51L that in fact there are very fundamental things about the space shuttle that we still don't fully understand, that it truly is still an experimental vehicle, a test vehicle, as Admiral Gaiman would tell you. And that despite having flown it for all of these years, more than 2 decades at the time of the Columbia accident, that there were still things that laid out there in terms of issues and problems that were not that well understood about some of the most fundamental things. And I'll be frank, I'm not sure there really is sort of a lesson to be learned there for PAO other than ask lots of questions and don't take anything for granted. If an engineer comes to public affairs officer, though, and says, this is the way that it is and this is the way this system works, I mean, a public affairs officer typically doesn't have the expertise to challenge that engineer's conclusion. And in fact, one of the things that the public affairs officers who report to me, one of the things I tell them is our job is to be communicators. We shouldn't be in the business of, you know, getting into engineering debates and scientific debates and things like that. Let the engineers and let the scientists discuss those issues and worry about, you know, the science of this or the engineering of this. But once they figure that out, then our job is to communicate that consensus, whatever it is, to the best of our ability. So the fact that the engineers got something fundamentally wrong the way that they did in terms of understanding the vulnerability of the TPS on the shuttle, or at least becoming comfortable over time with impacts to the TPS and maybe misinterpreting how dangerous they truly were. I'm not sure I would extrapolate that out into any sort of a lesson learned for public affairs because, again, other than public affairs officers being questioning and sort of vigilant about what's going on, I'm not sure that I would ever ask them to challenge the scientific conclusions or engineering conclusions that are made by experts. My key takeaway from this as a reporter who covered the accident, and it's only been reinforced by my current job, is you're always better telling your story as fully, as honestly, and as quickly as you possibly can. I don't think there's any question that the way that the news media reported the Columbia accident and how favorable is not the right word, but, you know, objective and honest and accurate the reporting was is a direct reflection of the way that NASA Public Affairs worked in the months following the accident as compared to what happened in the aftermath of the Challenger accident, which was very different. And there was wild speculation and there was animosity between many members of the press corps and a lot of NASA senior managers. And I think if you look at, you know, those two cases side by side, it shows you that NASA really got it right after the Columbia accident. And frankly, I would argue that probably the darkest days of NASA public affairs ever was the aftermath of the Challenger accident. There's two old adages in public relations, and I mentioned one of them earlier, but they are always tell your own bad news, and bad news never gets better with time. So NASA really seemed to take those two adages to heart after the Columbia accident, and I think the result was they got a lot better reporting, a lot more accurate reporting as a result. And I think that my key takeaway would be if we ever are in a situation similar to that again, that obviously it makes sense to try and do exactly the right thing, get as much information out there as quickly as we can, as accurately as we can.